yo creo que este congreso va a ser muy interesante, sobre todo por todas las participaciones, ¿no?, que nos van a iluminar y nos van a abrir un montón de preguntas respecto a estas cuestiones, ¿no? Yo creo que cada vez que realizamos el proyecto una acción, que evidentemente es un proceso de transferencia, pero no me gusta mucho esa palabra, lo importante es el discurso público, es decir, llevar todo esto al discurso público, al diálogo, ¿no? Y es aquí, a pesar de la distancia, ¿no?, donde se establecen estos vínculos afectivos y también nuevas posibilidades de interpretación de nuestro mundo, ¿no? Bueno, por último, decir que el archivo Ares es un proyecto también que surge, como he dicho antes, en 2014, que su reflexión como nuclear está relacionado con las prácticas artísticas del videoarte español, pues desde los años 70, ¿no? Y sobre todo se marca en esa especie de deseo viral de archivo, que para mí es eso, el deseo de releer, de reescribir, de hacer memoria, de recuperar la historia y también de posibilitar la visibilización de otras concepciones de la subjetividad, ¿no?, en relación con nuestro mundo. Es decir, es un archivo que no se concibe como una limitación, sino como un mundo de libertad o posibilidades de libertad. También no puedo enumerar, de la misma forma que no puedo enumerar a todas las personas que han trabajado con nosotros, pues bueno, todas las acciones que hemos hecho desde una labor de catalogación impresionante, con más de 200 artistas y obras, publicaciones, congresos y bueno, y talleres, ¿no? Y también aquí sería el lugar de agradecer a los dos equipos de investigación, tanto del proyecto I+D anterior, Ares, como este EShID, bueno, todos sus miembros, desde los investigadores principales, investigadores del equipo de trabajo, todos los becarios que hemos tenido, ¿no? Todo esto es posible gracias al esfuerzo, al entusiasmo, al apoyo, ¿no?, de todos ellos. Bueno, por último, deciros 2 o 3 cosas, ¿no?, insistir en esta vocación que tiene Ares, ¿no?, sobre abrir puertas a la reflexión en el espacio visual, ¿no?, reflexión de las nociones de la identidad, que se entrecruzan esos discursos colectivos e individuales, ¿no?, y que tienen la voluntad eso, de abrir espacio en cuestiones tan cruciales ahora mismo como los debates entre comunidad y nación, la historia cultural, la igualdad de género, la visibilización de la vida cotidiana, el compromiso también con la raza y la construcción cultural, ¿no? Bueno, y vanado con esto, y aquí me voy a cosas que para mí son muy importantes, ¿no?, se hilvanan cosas como la visualización de la política, la explotación, los medios, las de masas, la inmigración, la memoria, el olvido, el amor, el deseo, el miedo y el silencio, ¿no? Y bueno, yo creo también que el arte tiene, sigo pensando, ¿no?, que a pesar de este espectáculo global, el arte tiene, las prácticas artísticas tienen esta voluntad de resistencia, ¿no?, esta voluntad de visibilizar otros espacios de vida y de afecto, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, nuestro proyecto se marca en esta necesidad de trasladar la emoción a la vida pública y, por supuesto, al análisis y la reflexión de las prácticas artísticas. También tiene esta vocación de recuperar estos testimonios históricos, que no son otra cosa que fragmentos de lo que somos, de lo que fuimos y de lo que seremos, ¿no?, y testimonios de la diferencia frente al olvido. Y por último, deciros que quizá el propósito final de Ares EShID me recuerda a la voluntad del narrador, a la metáfora de Sherezade. El tiempo de la vida es el tiempo de la narración. Así abriendo posibilidades de tejer hilos, de realizar suturas en un mundo que lamentablemente seguimos sumidos en una violencia constante. Y esta violencia solo es posible, y ya todos recordáis a Benjamin o a Hannah Arendt, trasladarla al espacio del diálogo en la esfera pública. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a todos y a todas, porque en estos tiempos tan complejos en los que vivimos desbordados por los acontecimientos habéis encontrado un tiempo imprescindible para estar aquí con nosotros. Y bueno, confiemos en que este viaje continúe y se abran nuevos espacios, se digan nuevas palabras, hagamos nuevos viajes y algo muy importante, que pronto nos abracemos. Bueno, muchas gracias de nuevo.
De acuerdo, muchísimas gracias a ti, Ana. Y bueno, yo no sé mucho de protocolos, Ricardo, señor rector, querido Ricardo, si no te parece mal, te doy la palabra a ti ahora.
Muchas gracias, Antonio, señor decano de la Facultad de Filosofía, profesora Martínez-Collado. Ana, gracias por esa invocación del abrazo como forma de comunicación necesaria, imprescindible, por excelencia, incluso en la distancia virtual. Gracias por la organización de este congreso sobre videoarte y gracias por ese proyecto de investigación interdisciplinar, interuniversitario, que ha superado las dificultades del espacio gracias a unas tecnologías que pueden servir para cualquier cosa, ¿no? Para lo que queramos, para lo que los seres humanos queramos hacer con ellas, ¿no? El vídeo, las tecnologías de la información y la comunicación, incluso la luz, pueden ser utilizadas en un sentido positivo o no tanto, ¿no? Leía ayer mismo unas páginas de Gilles Deleuze sobre las sociedades del control en las que exponía la anécdota histórica de los efectos de la primera iluminación de Londres sobre los indigentes que tenían que deambular durante toda la noche porque al ser iluminados por el alumbrado no podían descansar en los parques públicos ni en los bancos. De igual manera, el vídeo, las tecnologías de vídeo pueden ser una herramienta de cultura muy poderosa, muy positiva, como este congreso demostrará, de transmisión de mensajes de conciliación y de reflexión para los seres humanos, o puede ser una herramienta también de control. La cultura, decía Freud, genera malestar, aunque Freud tenía una visión pesimista, en cierto modo, del ser humano. Mucho más agradable era la interpretación de Marcuse, demasiado olvidada en estos tiempos, sobre las posibilidades reales de combinar la cultura, la civilización y el disfrute, ¿no? Una invocación a Marcuse en tiempos de pandemia y sobre todo pensando en la post-pandemia, en un congreso sobre arte, sobre videoarte, sobre comunicación humana, que es un mensaje tan salmantino, el de la Escuela de Salamanca, me parece necesaria. Junto al agradecimiento a los investigadores, yo quiero destacar que se ha elegido un tema un objeto de debate y de investigación crucial. Hace algunos meses, un personaje hoy entrado casi en una fase caricaturesca, pero que ha sido el hombre más poderoso del mundo y que se resiste a serlo, amenazó con prohibir una de las redes sociales emergentes más populares entre los jóvenes, que tiene alguna relación con los temas que aquí se va a tratar, porque las expresiones artísticas en vídeo tienen una cantera fantástica en esas redes sociales que experimentan con mensajes a gran escala y se comunican entre ellos. Quizás pueda tener que ver con el efecto sociológico y cultural que están produciendo esas redes, que no es alimentar el extremismo, aunque pudiera producirse también esa deriva, sino incrementar una visión inclusiva y comprensiva en las generaciones que nos siguen. Esto es lo que nos trasladan ellos, la apertura de la comunicación, la capacidad en un escenario libre de transmitir mensajes, está generando una posibilidad mayor de entendimiento entre personas que tienen formas de ser muy diversas. La cultura, el arte siempre ha servido para esto y la imagen en movimiento tiene una potencia insuperable por razones puramente cognitivas. Quizás el activo más valioso de nuestro tiempo y el más difícil de mantener, de lograr, es la atención. Pues bien, la atención se consigue con el movimiento y con la imagen. Así que el poder de esta expresión cultural, ya digo, es irrefrenable. Utilícese no para el lado oscuro de la fuerza, sino para conseguir ese abrazo entre personas que piensan de manera distinta y que se entienden porque se reconocen aún en la distancia, ¿no? Ese es el mensaje de Salamanca, el de Vitoria, el de Notario, el de nuestro tiempo, como lo ha sido siempre. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a ti, Ricardo, no solamente por tu presencia esta mañana, que bien sé que la tienes muy complicada, sino por el apoyo permanente a la Facultad de Filosofía y a todas las actividades que vamos haciendo, ¿no? Te lo agradezco muchísimo y para nosotros es muy importante ese respaldo institucional porque no siempre lo hemos tenido, por una parte, y por otra parte porque lo que empieza hoy es eso, es un primer congreso que de hecho esperamos, como bien señalaba Ana también, que tenga después continuación en otros muchos. Yo quiero subrayar ese carácter de primero porque queremos que sea el primero de muchos, ¿verdad, Ana? Pero también es internacional y yo subrayaría que esa internacionalidad, apuntando también a lo que decías tú, Ricardo, a lo que decía el señor rector, en nuestro caso tiene un marcado acento iberoamericano. En este congreso tenemos presencia iberoamericana, tenemos presencia también portuguesa y esa puede ser también una de las líneas que a mí me gustaría destacar en esta breve presentación. Y hay también un elemento muy importante, por supuesto, los agradecimientos al área de estética, no solamente de aquí, de la Universidad de Salamanca, sino de todas las universidades que prácticamente sin excepción, pues han colaborado también en la elaboración, ¿verdad, Ana?, de todo este congreso y que va más allá porque no solamente el área de estética y teoría de las artes, sino que hemos contado y contamos con muchos colegas y compañeros y compañeras de Bellas Artes, de Historia del Arte, que está ya entre nosotros ahora Javier Panera. Y entonces yo creo que esas hibridaciones de la estética muchas veces tienen también mucho que ver con no tanto con las hibridaciones personales, pero sí con una red de personas que es lo que está detrás de luego las posibles redes científicas que estamos intentando construir, que estamos intentando implementar. La estética hoy ejerce como anfitriona, la Facultad de Filosofía ejerce como anfitriona, pero es un trabajo colectivo sin duda y yo agradezco mucho al destino que me haya puesto cerca de Ana Martínez-Collado y de José Luis Panea para poder trabajar juntos y para poder hacer realidad este congreso. Y solamente daría un pequeño apunte porque no quiero aprovechar que soy el anfitrión, ¿no? Y es el hecho de que hablamos mucho de investigación, hablamos mucho de docencia y a veces se nos olvida reivindicar algo que seguramente a mi querido Fernando Pereira le va a encantar escuchar, y es que la creación también es investigación. Eso es algo que yo llevo reivindicando muchísimo tiempo. Se investigan los archivos, se investigan las bibliotecas, se investigan los laboratorios y ojalá y siga avanzando y que llegue a buen puerto toda la investigación en laboratorios de distintos tipos. Pero la creación artística, las prácticas artísticas también son una forma de investigación. Y eso en nuestro país no lo tienen claro muchos de los responsables de la investigación y es una lucha que yo creo que tendríamos que seguir dando. Pero no me voy a enrollar porque mi función aquí es solamente la de presentar, agradecer de nuevo a todos los que han colaborado, a todas las que han colaborado y vamos a ver si efectivamente este debate, esta presentación conjunta de académicos, de artistas, de investigadores, de investigadoras, pues da sus frutos y podemos avanzar en el conocimiento, en la investigación y, ¿por qué no?, pues también en el disfrute. De acuerdo. Muchísimas gracias, Ricardo. Vamos a dar, en unos minutos vamos a comenzar la primera conferencia. Sé que no te puedes quedar, pero te mando un abrazo virtual. ¿De acuerdo?
Muchas gracias. Éxito y salud.
De acuerdo. Salud, Ricardo. Hasta luego.
Estoy encantada de abrir casi el primer Congreso Internacional de Estéticas Híbridas de la Imagen en Movimiento y de presentar a mi ex colega y muy apreciada Caroline Bainbridge, que es catedrática de Cultura y Psicoanálisis de la Universidad de Roehampton de Londres y también es editora de la sección de cine de la Revista Internacional de Psicoanálisis. Entre sus libros se incluyen The Cinema of Lars von Trier, Authenticity and Artifice del 2007 y Feminine Cinematics, Lucy Rigaray, Women and Film del 2008, así como una serie de antologías sobre psicoanálisis y cultura coeditadas con Candida Yates. Junto con Yates es editora de la serie de libros Psicoanálisis y Cultura Popular, publicada por Routledge, y fundadora y directora de la red de investigación Media and the Inner World. Es investigadora asociada en el Freud Museum de Londres, investigadora fundadora del British Psychoanalytic Council y miembro de la Royal Society of Arts. Está certificada por el Tavistock and Portsmouth NHS Trust. Esto es como el sistema de salud nacional, como consultora organizacional psicoanalítica y además es entrenadora registrada y afiliada al Analytic Network. Escribe, hace presentaciones y da charlas regularmente sobre psicoanálisis, género, televisión, cine y cultura popular. No sé si Caroline quiere que diga algo más, pero bueno, como ya prácticamente sabéis todos, Caroline va a empezar va a hacer una presentación que se titula Cracking Up, Joker and the Mediatisation of the Arse-end of the World.
Muchísimas gracias, Elvira. Y quiero empezar en español a decir muchas gracias por la generosa presentación y por la invitación a presentar mi trabajo hoy. Me gustaría felicitar a Ana y a José Luis y a todos los organizadores por hacer un trabajo tan profesional en la planificación de la conferencia online y hacerme todo tan fácil. Es muy maravillosa. Lo siento. Me gustaría también agradecerles a todos por su paciencia en la discusión más adelante, ya que tendré que responder a cualquier pregunta en inglés. Aunque mi fluidez auditiva en español está bien, hace mucho tiempo, muchísimo tiempo, que no tuve la oportunidad de practicar el habla. Necesito viajar a España lo antes posible para rectificar esto y esto me hará muy feliz. Muchas gracias. Pues.
Estás invitada.
Claro que sí.
Bueno, voy a empezar a share. Un momentito. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the recent film by Todd Phillips called Joker, which I'm sure many of you have been able to see. I understand that it became the fastest and highest grossing box office hit of any superhero movie genre. So it's a really kind of popular international global success story. And I think beyond that, it's also become a very popular cultural object. It's an object, and I'm using this word psychoanalytically and thinking about our psychological connection to the film. I think in that sense, the film evokes the feeling of what I want to refer to as our neoliberal conjuncture, this moment in which we're living and witnessing the collapse of neoliberalism, I think, alongside the rise, of course, of a new wave of populism. Now, Joker, I think, provides us with a useful window onto the role of splitting, creating kind of oppositions, binary oppositions, but also onto the role of anxiety, fear and dread in shaping ideological breakdown that seems to be threatening us as the intensities of neoliberalism deepen and implode. And of course, as ecological collapse and structural racism and health inequalities emerge as the very driving issues of our time. So in this talk, I'd like to invite you to consider Joker as a vehicle of mediatization, one that gives us some kind of insight into the cultural, emotional, and psychological mechanics of a very shifting moment of ideology. And I like to think that the film offers us a chance to think about its impact on our understandings of identity, society, relatedness, and responsibility. Now, the cultural studies scholar Jeremy Gilbert argues that doing conjunctural analysis remains strategically relevant at the start of the 21st century. And he states that culture indexes important shifts in the way that social, political, and economic processes are actively experienced, at a subjective and microsocial scale, as well as in the wider public sphere. And I think Joker rather provides a concentrated set of representations that signal for us the complex, challenging terrain of contemporary experience, just when the threat of breakdown seems all too real. The film's narrative unfolds over an unclearly determined period of time that spans an electoral campaign taking place in the fictional Gotham City. And at the end of the film, there is a hint that the year of action may be 1981, when Peter Midak's Zorro, the Gay Blade, had its cinematic release. And this is the film that the Wayne family goes to watch at the cinema at the end of the film, just before the parents of the boy who will eventually become Batman are of course killed by a clown protester outside the cinema. Now 1981, of course, is when Ronald Reagan, the Hollywood actor, was elected as president in the United States of America, marking the beginning of what we now call neoliberalism. And we can understand neoliberalism as an economic system that dominated until the global financial crash of 2008. Now, 2008, of course, marks another turning point as the underlying authoritarian populism of the neoliberal mentality began to seep into the public sphere and led to the very divisive events of 2016 and the rise of the populist mindset that saw the election of Trump in the United States, the vote for Brexit in the UK, and a broader global populist turn. I think Joker articulates all of these different aspects of political and ideological history through its central figure, Arthur Fleck, who is of course played marvelously by Joaquin Phoenix, a middle-aged white male member of a forgotten underclass for whom poverty, mental ill health, unemployment, and pathological loneliness are the stuff of everyday experience. So to say that the atmosphere of the film is bleak remains something of an understatement, as critics across different journalistic contexts have been keen to note. Reviews of the film suggest on the one hand that it's absolutely essential viewing, but paradoxically, reviewers also refer to it as the greatest and most dangerous film ever made. This is quite a set of claims around one particular movie. So the reception of Joker, I think, enacts the kind of splitting and binary thinking that I think are typical of a moment in which danger and despair feel all too real. So as a barometer of this Western ideological conjuncture in which binaristic division, toxic culture, and the demise of liberal freedoms are dominant, Joker seems to articulate experiences of anxiety, and it evokes a zeitgeist that we could describe as a paranoid schizoid mentality. And here I'm drawing on the ideas of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein. When Klein talks about the paranoid schizoid mentality, she's referring to a mindset in which objects and experience and emotion are characterized as either good or bad, and in which nuanced ambiguity and ambivalence can't actually be considered. It's a very infantile and very immature state of mind. And I think this is something that we see not just inside Joker itself, but also in the context of reading the broader cultural reception of the film and debates about its meaning. At the same time, though, we need to remember that Joker confronts viewers with challenging invitations to reflect on its very distressing content. And this suggests that a more responsible and reparative mindset is nevertheless within reach. And if you'll just bear with me, I'm going to flick to a clip so that I can show you a clip with the best quality. If I show it to you from inside the PowerPoint, it's a bit shaky. Now, can you hear me? Sorry. something seems to have gone a little bit wrong. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, so in that clip, I think what we see is a really interesting evocation of this idea that we're split between feelings of anxiety and the desire for something that feels safe. So what we see is Fleck feeling so overwhelmed by his experience and so overwhelmed by the state of the world and the state of his mind that he apparently this was not scripted, but was something that was just captured on camera and made it into the final movie, which I find quite interesting, that Phoenix, the actor, kind of decides that this is a way of evoking the mental state of the character Arthur Fleck. He climbs inside the fridge, which kind of simultaneously kind of gives us this image of him being out in the cold, literally in the cold, you know, shut away. But at the same time, the climbing of such a tall figure into such a tiny space really kind of structures this idea of a desire for being closely contained and being held in a safe place. So I find it very interesting. Now, Joker, of course, is part of a cinematic era in which superhero films have really dominated at the box office. And in fact, the film broke all box office records for R or 15 rated films. But the film isn't an archetypal example of this genre. And the director Phillips himself has noted that he actually secured the involvement of Joaquin Phoenix in the project by, and I'm quoting, by suggesting that they would sneak a real movie into the studio system under the guise of a comic book film. And he said, let's make a real movie with a real budget and call it fucking Joker. And that's a direct quotation. So despite the clear influence in the film of art house directors such as Martin Scorsese, Phillips makes canny use of the discourse of superhero films to ensure, firstly, the film's reach and success, but secondly, that he can achieve the art film aims that he is aspiring to. Now, the now rather tired trope of the superhero film that has really dominated recent cinema has been directly linked to the neoliberal conjuncture by way of the economic crash of 2008 by various critics. And the appeal of the superhero is, I think, clearly connected to the widespread fear that forms of authority associated with hegemonic whiteness and masculinity are sinking. And I think this kind of collapse is very evident to us on screen in Joker itself. Now, in psychoanalytic writings about superheroes, the displacement of power and moral authority onto masked crusaders is a symptom of the struggle to express power and individuality in the face of overwhelming social and ideological forces. So it's not that this splitting between superhero and supervillain characters and their alter egos indicates a simplistic form of unconscious wish fulfillment. That's not what I'm suggesting. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that the splitting provides a reflection of what the psychoanalyst Ligorsky has described as the need to dissociate and compartmentalize those aspects of the self that are powerful and exceptional. So in other words, aspects of the self that we feel to be powerful and exceptional feel very dangerous in this context. In the context of Joker, the most powerful aspects of Fleck's self-experience are actually murderous. And I think they express the depth of despair and anger provoked by a system of social exclusion that's created by meritocratic processes of neoliberalism, as described by Joe Littler in the context of cultural studies. Like the garbage piling up on the streets, Fleck's selfhood is reduced to a distasteful discard, and its intersectional complexities are left tainted, allowing the film to gloss over its class dynamics and its discourses of madness and crime. And I'm not quite sure that you can see this on the screen, but where that red arrow is in the right-hand side of the image on screen, there's a giant rat in shot. And it's obviously an artificial rat, but it's very, very interesting that Phillips has brought in images of overgrown rats, and we have a lot about rat-infested streets in the movie. Now, I think the entanglement of Arthur Fleck's mental illness with violence has also been the subject of a great deal of soul-searching commentary in the media coverage of the film. And this is because the film appears to depict psychological illness as the root of violence and not as the result of increased vulnerability. Now, this, I think, is a very dangerous and surface reading, one that overlooks how a very familiar media trope associating mental illness with a tendency towards violence actually buries and hides and occludes the systemic violence of neoliberal ideology. At a deeper level, the film, I think, articulates the psychosocial impacts of neoliberalism inside the minds of neoliberal subjects. And it also speaks to our slide into a populist mentality over recent years. And this, thinking about the film in this way, I think allows a more creative understanding of the failures of the system itself. The media madness and violence debate also overlooks the film's invitation to identify projectively with the anxious state of mind created by the neoliberal social contract. And this is what we see in the characterization of Arthur Fleck as distinct from his Joker persona. So my suggestion here is that the film invites us as viewers to evacuate our own unconscious neoliberal anxieties so as to identify with Fleck's experience. And I think that this has a therapeutic element, a therapeutic aspect to us as viewers. So whereas some critics argue that Joker detracts from important conversations about wealth inequality and social responsibility, a psychoanalytic approach shows that it powerfully enacts exactly these concerns. And I'm going to go on in a few moments to discuss the work of the psychoanalyst Donald Meltzer, who created a really useful concept for thinking about Joker, which is called the Claustrum. And Meltzer's concept of the Claustrum also uses mechanisms of projective and introjective identification and gives us a really fascinating model through which to explore the film. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what I mean when I'm talking about projective identification in particular. The concept of projective identification helps us to understand both on-screen characterization and cinematic viewership and pleasure. In Joker, Fleck's experience seems relatable to us as viewers, to use a very popular word of the moment, because Fleck is clearly socially isolated, and this is connected in the narrative directly to the medical condition that causes him to laugh inappropriately in an uncontrolled manner. And I'm just going to remind you about this with another clip. So this is obviously a really painful scene to watch, at least I find it very painful. And it's not the only scene in which we see Fleck dissolving or being kind of overtaken in this very embodied way, where his laughter erupts and his painful experience is really excruciating. It seems to really inhabit his body. And this is a kind of outstanding element of Phoenix's performance, of course. It's often, I think, in the film, not clear whether we're seeing laughter or tears when he is overcome in this way. And I think his contorted facial expressions really connote distress and existential pain, whether as viewers we see this as him laughing hysterically or being on the verge of crying. So as viewers then, what we're invited to do here is to empathise with Fleck, to put ourselves into Fleck's shoes. And this is a really key illustration of how the psychoanalytic idea of projective identification operates. For the identifying viewer, Fleck seems to embody the deep discomforts of living within a social and emotional economy in which the severe pain and suffering of those who have been banished to the underclass becomes difficult to think about or to imagine. And Fleck himself also seems to projectively identify with his mother's delusions about the identity of his father, and of course with her own disavowal of her own history of abuse and mental illness. And Fleck's really hopeful efforts to connect with Thomas Wayne, the man that his mother suggests is his father, is very kind of overlaid with hope, and he makes a lot of effort to try to connect with both Thomas Wayne and Bruce, who will eventually, of course, go on to become Batman. And I think that these hopeful efforts really reveal a really painful lack of meaningful object relations for Arthur Fleck inside his mind. He seems to have had no real chance to explore functional forms of white masculinity. And he seems to want to connect emotionally with both characters as a way of putting a stop to all the loss and violence in his life. And again, I've got another clip for you. I'm hoping this one won't be interrupted by an advertisement. Let's hope so. The psychoanalyst Martin E. Widzer observes about the comic book version of the Joker that supervillains are not all bad, and that they intermittently align themselves with the heroes to display their good side. So just as Bruce Wayne and his alter ego Batman will eventually go on to become like his idealized father, in Phillips's Joker, Fleck seems to take on the dark side of Thomas Wayne's authority. Now for Widzer, as a supervillain, the Joker subsumes what he calls the rejected parts of the father figure. So in other words, he exposes the dark underbelly of the neoliberal ideology that Wayne Sr. represents in his mayoral campaign, and in his promise to get rid of the clowns that threaten Gotham's economic future. And for viewers, this part of the film allows us to recognise the deep-seated discomfort of what Vicky Lebeau calls the bystander mentality that dominates the contemporary political scene. Now, as Lebeau notes in her work on the very different film, I, Daniel Blake, the neoliberal conjuncture leaves very many people with what she describes as no mind, no life, and no future. And when the social democratic settlement seems to break down, there's almost a Jekyll and Hyde kind of discourse about dependence. And this leads to both potential breakdown and at the same time an enhanced understanding of what care should apparently look like. And so this splitting again is really important, and I think it opens up really crucial reflective spaces for thinking about what we understand as social responsibility in this context. And I've argued elsewhere that films can function as a kind of transformational object in the way described by Christopher Bollas. And here, Bollas, I'm thinking about Bollas's claim that a transformational object is one that enables us to experience it as an environment that gives us a potential to change or refashion ourselves. Now, in all of this, the idea of projective identification is a really key mechanism for the kind of containment that cinema can offer us. And cinema, I think, can create a mental space for us to metabolize very complex, contradictory feelings and experience about selfhood and relatedness and social forces. However, projective identification is also the structuring mechanism of the concept I mentioned earlier on, the Claustrum, theorized by Donald Meltzer. And in theorizing this term, Meltzer is referring to aspects of the mind, compartments of the mind, that refer to the head, breast, genitals, and rectal compartments of the internal maternal object. And so here what I mean is the idea of a mother, the version of the mother that exists inside the unconscious mind and that helps us to process difficult self-experience. Now, Meltzer explains that experiences of the Claustrum cast the subject as an intruder into the insides of the maternal object inside the mind. And the Claustrum provides an opportunity for us to process experiences of the external world and our external objects, while also depleting the psychological power of this maternal object inside the mind, which actually sustains us as we devour its energy. So the Claustrum for Meltzer is something akin to the very edge of madness. And when we're in the Claustrum, we're in a Claustrum state of mind, the subject is really taking refuge. So the subject has a kind of incarcerated quality, as Meltzer puts it. It's almost as though the subject feels trapped, and being inside the Claustrum kind of intensifies this feeling. And when we're in that kind of state of mind, the atmosphere is really of a child who has lost their way, or who has forgotten the qualities of what it feels like to be at home. So life in the Claustrum entails no real sense of human contact, and the atmosphere is really one of feeling very cut off. Now in Joker, with its very dystopian vision of Gotham City as a seething den of rat-infested, rubbish-strewn malaise, the concept of the Claustrum really helpfully highlights the significance of the toxic environment, I think. And Meltzer describes the deadliness of the Claustrum, suggesting that it's inflected with what he calls emotional flatness and an atmosphere of contempt. And there are strong resonances with the mise-en-scène of Joker throughout, I think. Sorry, I'll just move on to the next slide. The film allows us to think about the toxic experience of living through the era of neoliberalism, something that and its eventual collapse. And this is what I'm referring to when I call Joker an expression of the arse-end of the world. It's a kind of attempt in English at a pun between the kind of rectal compartment of the Claustrum and the collapse of neoliberalism, and in that English idiom, the arse-end of the universe. And I think that in doing this, the film shows how the evacuation of internalized toxicity and poison and the processing of malign fear helps to shape ideas about the very insidious effects of neoliberalism. And I said earlier that the film ends with an intertextual reference to that movie released in 1981, The Gay Blade. And 1981, of course, the year when the neoliberal project first reared its head. And so I think there is something symbolic in what the film achieves, because it allows us as viewers to contemplate how neoliberal discourse has framed our own lived experience. And so it helps us to be able to split off our own ideological inscription in neoliberalism and to be able to contemplate it as a result, because of the way that the film kind of enables us to do projective identification. Now, the critic Maria Flood has argued that Joker uses very specific film techniques to encourage our empathy with Arthur Fleck. And instead of making use of point of view shots and close-ups, for instance, we often see Fleck through a range of distorted surfaces, such as windows and mirrors and television screens. And these are strategies that we might note that encourage the alienation of viewers from a more standard kind of cinematic identification with Fleck as an anti-hero. So we very frequently see him on public transport, for instance, or taking refuge in really small contained spaces like that fridge I showed you earlier on, or the unsavory public toilets, that scene that's very well known from the film. So to go back to Meltzer's ideas about the Claustrum, the incarcerated quality, the trapped quality, I think is on show in these aesthetics. Now, crucially, Meltzer says that the Claustrum isn't simply a closed off space like the delusional systems created by psychotic patients. So inhabiting the Claustrum doesn't entail being totally cut off from psychic reality or the outside world. As Meltzer puts it, the door remains ever so open. But in the clinical setting, Meltzer outlines how dreams tell us about the Claustrum. And so, for example, dreaming about looking or talking to people through windows and doors, or being on a departing train or in an airport terminal, or sitting in an audience without knowing anyone else. These ideas all resonate for me very clearly with Joker. And I think that, as Meltzer argues, in the Claustrum, human relationships and the world in its natural or man-made aspects make no emotional impact, except for the distant thunder of anxiety, And this, for me, evokes my experience of watching this film. The film shows Fleck as a terribly dislocated individual. His experiences on the streets and in the underground spaces of Gotham City speak to his descent psychologically into the fraught and yet grandiose compartments of the mind that offer refuge for him inside his imagined maternal object, but they don't offer him anything at all in terms of solace or safety. Now, in the Claustrum, the pull is toward inventing a story of emotional impact based on hearsay and recollection. And this can lead to a state of excitement that shows itself as making oneself laugh or cry. Again, a very pertinent example in connection to this film, or perhaps in making oneself feel sexually aroused or having deep feelings of revenge or horror at the state of the world. And in all of these emotional states, the overriding texture is one of inauthenticity and a lack of conviction. For Meltzer, the Claustrum allows the self to take on cynical attitudes and to identify as a hero of the resistance, another theme that resonates with the Joker. And the nightmarish quality of experience is difficult to escape, and it intensifies the temptation that we have to scavenge for aspects of identity, to find a route out of feeling so trapped. Again, another metaphor for the collapse of the neoliberal mentality. So the Claustrum often feels as though it has no exit, and so survival at all costs becomes essential. Emotional links are replaced by a tendency to invent stories and allegories, so that the picture of the world becomes inflected by political experience, and beating the system becomes the most meaningful objective. Again, I think you can see the parallels with the unfolding experience of Fleck as he steps ever more closely into his identification with his Joker persona. Now, for Meltzer, Claustrum dwelling has really important parallels with social organization in the outside world. And projective identification is what's used to give us access to the Claustrum compartments. And this repeats infantile experience when aspects of the self get lodged inside internal objects of the mind. And for Meltzer, this infantile experience structures the adult social world. And we see the effects, he says, in things like the way newspapers are split into different sections, or the way in which newspapers have very particular political affiliations and worldviews, helping to perpetuate prejudice of all kinds. And, you know, this is a very live kind of observation for us as we watch what's going on in the US election, I think. So in other words, the experience of projective identification in infancy provides cover for the way that we develop individual views of the world, and it helps to shape the values to which we tend to cling unthinkingly once we become adults. So the more we projectively identify, the more convicted our views become, so that we end up running the risk of prejudice and so on. And this technique of compartmentalization really affects our capacity for relatedness, but also it affects our mood and our social politics. And because we all experience projective identification as infants, we're all at risk of slipping into the Claustrum. As Meltzer puts it, any event that seems to threaten one's illusion of security nudges one into the Claustrum. Now, much has been made in the media of Joker's appeal in an era dominated by so-called incel culture. And by incel culture, I'm referring to a particularly objectionable form of white male sexism and entitlement that shows how digital environments perpetuate violent and abusive misogyny and racism. And the film's release led to an almost hysterical enactment of media-induced panic, because the fear was that it would be appropriated by incels and would lead to violence following screenings. And when incels post online, the posts that they make are referred to as shit posts. And there were lots of incel shit posts posted up on various incel websites, invoking reference to those who have perpetrated mass shootings in the US, for example, Elliot Rodger. And the fear was that the release of the film would incite copycat violence. And the threats were taken really seriously in the US. So the military issued a number of different warnings, and the media repeated those warnings, and troops were put on high alert in case of mass civil disobedience. But as the journalist Clarice Loffrey has observed, Joker is a perfect example of how easily we can lose control of certain narratives. A handful of reactions, she says, to the Venice Film Festival premiere mentioned how it could potentially be co-opted by incels and their ilk, but not in any way that felt particularly alarmist. Yet the word, as Loffrey says, was immediately zeroed in on and picked up by largely well-meaning people who hadn't actually seen the film, but who still echoed and amplified the notion until it became that incel movie. Scenes from the Joker have nevertheless been adapted by incels into memes, and they are used as a form of communication. Members of the incel community appear to identify introjectively with aspects of the Joker, as if its protagonist were an internal object of the mind, coloured with disturbed and disturbing emotional experiences that resonate with the toxic incel mindset. Introjective identification is when someone takes an aspect of what they see inside themselves as a way of strengthening their sense of self. And this is a parallel process to the projective identification I was talking about a few minutes ago, and is also a key mechanism of the Claustrum. Now, to come back to these incel memes, Reddit threads like the so-called gangweed one show us just how influential the Joker's image is. And the Joker's descent into violence is read as representing the collective incel desire to inflict mayhem on a world that's experienced as woke, in other words, too politically correct, and therefore intolerable of the dangerous mindset of this group. Now, at the same time, as we've seen, Joker provides an opportunity for projective identification and evacuation of this kind of toxic experience into a character who means a lot to the incel community. So this enables an enactment of the violent emotional imperatives that threaten to overwhelm the subject with their darkness. And I think we see this in Phoenix's twisty, contorted bodily performance as Arthur Fleck. It's almost as though Arthur Fleck turns into a fecal, turd-like being, and his claustrum-dwelling experience is brought to life on the screen here, inviting the kind of projection I'm talking about and providing an outlet for the most toxic elements of the neoliberal experience. So the incel fascination with the film and the broader media fascination with its appeal to incels provide an intensified understanding of these psychological mechanisms, and which show in their extreme associations how more everyday practices might work. And this is a key aspect of a psychoanalytic methodology, because we look at extreme behaviours to provide insight into everyday psychic life. And so I think it's possible to suggest that cinema opens up a mental space in which unconscious psychical experience is safely experienced. And this speaks to cinema's capacity to reassure, but also to disrupt, challenge, and affirm self-experience through its intimate invitations into pleasure and unpleasure alike. And so with its disruptive approach to the superhero narrative and its playful intertextual imitation of art house classics, Joker carves out space for a reappraisal of neoliberalism and its aftermath. I'm suggesting then that these uses of cinema as a psychological object are increasingly in tune with the lived experience of mediatization and the entanglement of offline selfhood with online identities and relationships. Media become a way of exploring selfhood and impact on who and how we feel ourselves to be, both in the context of virtual worlds and in real life in material social settings. The psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas draws on the philosopher Heidegger to argue that mediated lives and globalization intersect and overlap, interpolating contemporary subjects as bound up with a mass social transformation built on the foundation of the mobility field and its associated network capital. And for Bollas, contemporary life takes place often simultaneously in actual and virtual realms. So subjects become operants, and self-formation can be understood as transmissive. In other words, when we use objects that transmit information, we become part of their function. So we use the objects as a way of transmitting ourselves at the same time. So selfhood becomes a kind of form of content, if you like, and we become extensions of the media tools and platforms through which we live our lives. The psychological mechanisms of projective and introductive identification are crucial to this shift in self-formation, and media content helps us as consumers to switch between individual and group and active and passive experiences at pace in the high-speed attention economy of the digital age. So these transmissive self-practices of dissociation and splitting, they use dissociation and splitting in an effort to pass on experience. And this becomes the driving agent of an adaptive mental structure where retreat into enclaves represent an attempt to slow down the pace of contemporary life. Joker then provides a way of understanding the entanglement of mediatization and transmissive subjectivities, and it invites us into an intimate structure of identification that rids our minds of the unwanted paradoxical complexity of the neoliberal come populist conjuncture, and the splitting of the protagonist into a very bipartite character means that he embodies both the poverty of experience of those being cast aside by neoliberalism and the extraordinary violence that that experience engenders. Fleck/Joker becomes a vessel ripe for containing projections, allowing us as viewers allowing viewers who may feel tainted by the conjuncture of neoliberalism to purify themselves unconsciously by evacuating their own experience into the character who occupies the claustrum on their behalf. So Fleck-Joker becomes the fecal other, a dumping ground for all the most shame-inducing and toxic elements of the neoliberal mentality. But at the same time, his fecal form appeals to members of the incel community, for whom he becomes an emblem of the toxic rage inside, a transmissive object who can communicate the poisonous incel self-experience. As a cultural artifact then, Joker neither sanctions nor demonizes madness. Instead, it offers itself as a vehicle for our times, one that spectacularizes the shittiest elements of the Western conjuncture and then carries it away out of sight and potentially out of mind. In the film's closing sequence, Joker's violence takes place off camera for once, and we lose sight of him leading merry hell through the corridors of Arkham State Hospital. The madness of the current conjuncture may give the illusion of being able to be safely contained, repressed, or locked away, but the demise of neoliberalism really ought to be read as providing space to understand what Christopher Bollas presciently frames as the return of the oppressed. By reading Joker as a mediatization of the arse-end of the world, I suggest that its power lies in the perspective it creates on the complex internalized relations created by neoliberalism and its collapse. The film's mediatization of anxiety compounds the social and political dynamic, but also it paradoxically brings it to the surface. Despite his loathsome actions then, we can relate to Joker. As transmissive subjects, it's incumbent on us to refuse the apparent sanctuary of a mindless bystander gaze and to send in the clowns to speak truth to power around oppressed experience. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Caroline. Thank you very much. Very interesting interpretation, let's say, study, analysis of the Joker. No sé si tengo que hablar en castellano o en inglés.
A lo mejor, como tú quieras. En español es mejor para ti.
Vale, perdón, es que no me estaba dando cuenta. Decía que a ver si me ha parecido una súper interesante, espectacular también presentación del espectáculo del individuo neoliberal cuando ya se vuelve loco, ¿no? Que era lo que nos estaba contando Caroline. Primero, Preguntamos si hay preguntas. Hay un chat abierto, no sé si hay preguntas en el chat o ha servido para otra cosa. Tengo una pregunta. Rosa García, para todos. Vale. ¿Lo ves, Caroline, o lo leo?
Sí.
Pregunta en el chat abajo. Tengo una pregunta. Ups, se me fue. Vamos a ver si... Vale, a ver, lo abro.
Elvira,
Sí.
Rosa García puede preguntarla en directo.
Ah, vale, pues venga, es que lo estaba viendo ahí en el chat. Rosa, por favor, ¿puedes hacer la pregunta? Pues Rosa no se personifica, así que Fernando creo que quiere hacer una pregunta. Gracias.
Sí. Thank you, Caroline, for your intervention. I really love it. I have a question, which is, I've always considered Batman as a fascistic symbol. I mean, when the state, the police fails, he usually wins. And Joker represent the opposite of this. And this is the first film where we feel sympathy for him. He is one of us, not the usual villain of the other films. That's what I think. Do you consider him as a populistic figure, or a member of a community of as the scene of the masks of old people with the masks of the clowns, as a member of a community? Or do you consider all these arguments of the film as a violence warning to all of us, that only the mentally disturbed will fight in a fantasy world against this neoliberalism system? One last note only, because you didn't mention, and I really love it. It's the intensity of the soundtrack made by Ildur Gudnadottir, which is a really important element. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, for that interesting question. I think you've hit the nail on the head in lots of ways. I think that Joker here is not an emblem of a populist incel mindset. A populist or incel mindset, they're not the same thing. Instead, I think he does something very, very interesting, which is to invite us to kind of shake off the unconscious our unconscious inscription in a neoliberal mentality. So in a way, it's almost a call to action. It's a kind of gives us space to kind of understand that we've been, the premise of neoliberalism is that you get sucked into it. That's how it works. It's a very hegemonic formation. And so unwittingly and unthinkingly, we reproduce the neoliberal mentality. But I think what Joker, the character here, and the film does is to kind of suspend that unthinking relationship that we have to neoliberalism, and to make us see it, to make us see how dangerous and toxic it is, and to invite us to do something about it. So the film for me really acts as kind of, we've got this idea in the UK at the moment in the context of lockdown of circuit breakers. And I kind of think it's like breaking the circuit of neoliberalism to give us space to think about how you resist neoliberalism. And so that's why I think that it is a kind of opportunity to actually break away from the seductions of neoliberalism and populism, and to kind of try to think more critically and in terms of more socially responsible and socially engaged consideration for those who are most oppressed by the neoliberal agenda. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I think there was the question, if I am reading it correctly in the chat, was around the Joker, the gender of the Joker. And I do think it matters. Actually, I do really think it matters, because I think the kind of scene of most loss with the collapse of neoliberalism, the most dangerous scene of loss is for a kind of version of white, straight, male, middle class, respectable, heterosexual masculinity that these people are the most inscribed in the kind of neoliberal positions of authority and power. And so the collapse of neoliberalism really kind of puts white masculinities into a dangerous and therefore there is something the rise of the anti-hero in everybody from Don I think it's that one, okay. We see from everyone from Mad Men in Don Draper in Mad Men through to Walter White in Breaking Bad. There are just hundreds of anti-heroes kind of showing us the kind of dangerousness of white masculinity in this neoliberal context. So I do think that the gender of the Joker matters a lot, yes.
Caroline, te quiero felicitar por la excelente conferencia. Y bueno, a mí me interesa mucho lo que has respondido a la pregunta sobre el género, me parece muy brillante porque realmente, según el argumento que planteas, las figuras estereotipadas de lo masculino, el blanco, ¿no? Son los más afectados por esta especie de disrupción, ¿no? Psicológica del neoliberalismo, pero también incluso a mí me gustaría que me profundizar un poco en esa cuando ese sujeto cae atrapado por la violencia, por la enfermedad, por la ansiedad, en ese círculo que tú planteas, ¿no? del claustro, ¿no? Esa como extraposición del claustro a lo individual. ¿Cómo es posible romper el vínculo que plantea, que seguro que lo conoce Judith Butler, ¿no? La fijación a los polos del amo y el esclavo, ¿no? ¿Cómo es posible salir de ese círculo?
Sorry, I missed the very final part. You dropped out.
Repito. El final. ¿Cómo sería posible, ¿no? Cuando los personajes entran en el círculo de la violencia, ¿no? Y entran en un círculo que les produce enfermedad, ansiedad, ¿cómo es posible si recordamos pues, las teorías de la sujeción que tú conoces de Judith Butler, cómo es posible romper esa especie de cadena entre el amo y el esclavo, ¿no? Que el esclavo sería, el amo sería ese poder del neoliberalismo, ¿no? No sé si puedes proponer algo.
It's very, very difficult, I think, because of the, you know, what we know about ideology and what we know about the operation of hegemony is around the way that we get seduced to the position that we are interpolated into. But I think that there is something interesting going on at the moment, and you know, it's even here today in our kind of virtual conference, is the way in which the tools of digital technology and the tools of communication through digital technology interrupt the kind of idea that the self is inside the body, and give us an opportunity to kind of understand that the self is more than the body, and that that selfhood is something that can be put out there and reworked and re-experienced. And I think that there is something very interesting there. I haven't thought much about it. There's something very interesting there in the kind of ideas of having multiple dimensions of selfhood in different ideological spaces and different technological spaces that allow us to experiment and allow us to explore the relationship to power in very different ways. And I think we can see with the rise of kind of digital activism and the rise, you know, on the one hand on the far right, and with the dangerous kind of logic of, you know, incel culture is absolutely integral to kind of digital spaces. But on the other hand, the rise of grassroots activism being brought to kind of the surface in ways that we saw a few years ago with the Occupy movements, which of course Spain was a kind of front runner with the kind of occupations and so on. that these kind of points of political opportunity are fostered in these spaces that we don't yet know very well. And the power of these spaces, they're not colonized by ideology or hegemony, I should say, in the same way as the real world. So again, it's treading this kind of line between something quite dangerous and unknown and something quite potent and powerful. It's potent and powerful on all sides, but there is a kind of capacity to harness something as yet unknown and to explore that in ways that feel terrifying and also liberating at the same time. It's a very, I don't, you know, when I'm thinking psychoanalytically, I don't like to go down an either or kind of route. It's a both and I think something can be both terrifying and very, very liberating at the same time, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Yes. Muchas gracias, Caroline.
Perdonad, pero se nos está haciendo un poco tarde y me parece que Fernando está ahí un poco esperando porque es el próximo. Solamente dos comentarios. Uno, que la primera pregunta o la pregunta de Rosa García, que lo has leído, dice que gracias, que no puede activar el micrófono y la cámara, o sea que lo tengo que decir para que nadie piense que esto es una falta de urbanidad o algo así, ¿no? Y hay también una pregunta, de nada, Rosa, hay también una pregunta de Frank para todos, de alguna manera es como más una consideración, que dice algo así como que I think, bueno, todos lo estáis viendo, ¿no? Y que le ha parecido una conferencia excelente. Me parece que está muy bien la puntualización esa.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, that there is a kind of desperate scrabbling for power as neoliberal kind of authority collapses. And so I'm just, firstly as electoral politics and then frustrated because of the uselessness. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think we're seeing that, certainly in the UK, we're seeing that on every turn. You know, what we're getting in our domestic politics at the moment is just crazy. It's kind of an absolute representation of Fran's question here in terms of the desperate need to cling on to power. What feels so dangerous about this, that kind of neoliberal desperation in terms of holding on to power, is the way that it slides into authoritarianism. And I think that becomes incredibly dangerous. It feels very dangerous. The landscape feels very dangerous at the moment. We're seeing, you know, an overturning of due democratic process, and we're seeing an overturning of a respect for the law. You know, we just have to look at the Brexit negotiations and the way in which our unconscionable Prime Minister is trying to break international law in order to hold on to power. And I think that there is something very live about that. So there is something dangerous going on at the same time that requires us to be vigilant. You know, we all become the vigilantes of the kind of superhero genre at the moment. That I think that we are in that position. You know, we need to be our own superheroes and kind of save decency.
Okay. Bueno, thank you very much, Caroline. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias por las preguntas también. Se nos ha hecho un poco tarde. Disculpas, Fernando. Tenemos que dejar paso al siguiente. Fascinante y un poco aterrador el panorama como es el que estamos viviendo. Muchísimas gracias, Caroline, por venir. Muchísimas gracias por la conferencia y hasta pronto.